Good day, young philosophers, and today we're going to talk about the concept of virtue. And this is an extraordinarily important concept in all of Aristotle because if you recall just a couple of classes ago when we were talking about the nature of happiness, which is a translation of the Greek word eudaimonia, we saw for Aristotle that it had to do entirely with our actions, right? That had to do with the kinds of actions that the kind of actions that we do and sort of the manner with which we do them, the way that we do them, right? And what we're going to see is Aristotle is going to talk about these virtue in important kind of ways. He's going to talk about virtuous acts, right? And in some ways, the virtuous acts is going to refer to certain kinds of actions that someone does, but more importantly, the manner with which someone does them, right? And so we're going to see fundamental within this week and next class connected back to happiness is how it's ultimately essential that if you want to be a happy person, that you need in some ways be a virtuous person. So here we're going to examine again the concept of virtue. But first of all, what the heck is virtue? What is virtue? And that's what we're going to examine here, right? So for Aristotle, virtue is really a translation of a particular Greek word. What we call the virtue is a translation of the Greek word arete, right? And arete, it's Arete with a little cute little thingy there. I forget what it's called, but it's arete. And often instead of the word virtue, the word arete sometimes can get translated more precisely as a kind of excellence, right? That arete is an excellence. When we talk about someone being virtuous, we talk about them being an excellent person, right? And so what does it mean? What does excellence look like in human action? Well, in general, the excellent person is someone does a kalon action. You guys remember what kalon meant? It meant the beautiful, right? What is beautiful, as opposed to just what, like, it's not just about what is pleasant to you, but something that's excellent, that's worthy of honor, right? So a virtuous person is able to do beautiful, excellent actions, right? But with the parent, what? How does a virtuous person make it look, right? Well, you might say ever so often you see someone that makes something look easy. So they do it with apparent ease and they do it with pleasure, right? That virtuous person does something excellent, something beautiful, and they do it like as if it was easy for them, and they do it with great pleasure, right? And so this is what a virtuous person ultimately refers to for Aristotle. This is interesting because when Aristotle, if we just think about his ethics in general, it's a kind of virtue ethics, and many other philosophers that we'll end up talking about in another class, we're going to talk about other approaches to ethics. We'll talk about Kant, we'll talk about Mill, and we'll talk about, in some ways, they're all about principles, they're all about getting down to fundamental rules or concepts that help us figure out what ethics look, what goodness looks like in action. But Aristotle is going to fundamentally direct us towards the kind of person that someone is. To be a virtuous person is the kind of person who does beautiful actions with ease and with pleasure, right? All right, so let's examine further, right? There's in general, there's actually three types of virtue, three types of ways that someone can be excellent, not just talking about anyway, there's three types of virtue. I'm sorry, my tongue got tied there, right? So what are the three types of virtue that we'll talk about? First of all, there's virtues of skill, right? Which in Greek are referred to as techne, right? And then there's virtues of intellect, right? The intellectual virtues. And these will kind of neglect for the most part. If you were to learn more about them, you could read book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics goes into great deal talking about the intellectual virtues. We're going to, for the most part, set that aside for our limited kind of class that we have here. But then finally, there's the virtues of character, right? Which are often also called moral virtues, right? The virtues of character fundamentally deal with all of sort of the feelings and the actions that are common to all people, right? And so the virtues of character have to do with all the feelings and actions that all people basically do. Let's take a step back. The first two we're not going to say too much about, but just to help us think about what this definition was of virtue, that someone does the beautiful action with ease and with pleasure, let's fundamentally think of a virtue of skill. Now, virtues of skill are the kind of virtues that you only want to acquire if you want to acquire a particular skill. Do you ever hear the phrase, someone is a virtuoso, right? And usually that's reference to musicians, right? I'm a musician myself. I play guitar. In fact, here's my guitar right now. Oh, look at that. It was a G chord. How nice, right? Musicians frequently are called virtuosos, and if you're a virtuoso, excuse me, I was away from the my camera there. If you're a virtuoso musician, it means like you play amazingly and beautifully and excellently, and it comes easily to you. Here's just another example of something that would be kind of a virtue of skill. Something like this. Do you guys recognize who this is? This is Michael Jordan, and just look at that, right? I am not going to claim to be an amazing fan of basketball, though I did live in Chicago, Illinois in the 90s when the Bulls won the championship 3 years in a row. And I remember seeing this guy, Michael Jordan, play basketball, and it was really quite something, right? And this image right here, I think it was from maybe a dunk contest or something like that. I don't remember. And this was actually part of an ad for Air Jordan sneakers and stuff. But just look at this guy is flying through the air. It's just like it's amazing what he's capable of doing right now. And if you could actually look really closely at some of the people's faces in this picture, it's kind of hard to see. But there's people who are just like mesmerized by what's happening in front of them. Like this guy here. I like this guy here. You can almost see his face. Just like eyes wide open. I don't know. But this is what virtue of skill looks like in one of its highest forms, right? It's someone who works at some type of craft and becomes amazing at it, right? So not everyone, though, needs to acquire a virtue of skill. Virtues of intellect, everyone should aim for. Again, I'm going to sort of leave them aside. We'll say some more about them in next week. But virtues of character, unlike the virtues of skill, they have to do with these feelings and actions that all people deal with, right? And so we're going to actually go through a list of some examples of what counts as virtues of character and skill. But for instance, I'll just say a couple things right now. Like if everyone has to deal with feelings of fear, right? Everyone has to deal with giving things to other people. Everything has to deal with the actions that would bring us pleasure or would bring us pain, right? Everyone has to do with actions that even involve being humorous and funny and being friendly. Like so, these kinds of things that we all have to deal with lead to a set of virtues that would sort of be us doing those things well. So if you can deal with fear well, right? If you can deal with hunger and desire well, if you can deal with anger well. These are all different kinds of virtues, and we'll go through some lists of those a little bit later. But there's ultimately three components to virtue, right? Three components that makes the virtuous person really virtuous. In particular, we're going to be mainly focusing on virtues of character, but elements of this would exist, especially in virtues of skill. Virtues of intellect are a little bit special, but they're actually connected to these things three as well. But in particular, when it comes to virtues of character, there's three components to consider. And the virtuous person has an excellent kind of understanding, an excellent kind of character, and an excellent kind of skill. Right? Notice that the word skill kind of showed up here again. But we'll talk in particular about the understanding, character, and skill in turn of the virtuous person. But the first thing I want to point out here is that when we think of how people go wrong, how do people fail to be virtue, it's usually in one of these three categories. People fail to be virtuous, right? We fail to be virtuous. I just noticed something. Pause. We fail to be virtuous fundamentally by lacking in understanding, lacking in character, or lacking in skill in some ways. So, we're going to sort of examine these in more detail as we go through at least two more videos about the concept of virtue. But the key idea is that if someone lacks an understanding, right, and we'll get into this as well, but remember when we talked about the distinction between universal and particular knowledge, if someone doesn't really see how to do a good thing in a particular circumstance, they might fail to be a virtuous person. If someone lacks character, for instance, some people kind of like want to do the right thing, but don't completely and fully want to do the right thing. It's mixed with other desires and other junk, then it's a kind of lack of character that someone might have, right? And sometimes people just lack skill to be able to do excellent actions, like you just don't have the ability, it's, and one of the things that we'll talk about here is sort of the distinction between, say, someone who like is a soldier or a child when it comes to very, very fearful circumstances like war, right? The skill set of a soldier, a skill set of a child are different, and we'll examine those in the next few videos. So I hope you enjoy, and I'll catch you in just a minute on the flip side.